Proud to be a member of the class of 1985 and also a member of the reunion committee for my class. I'd like to welcome my classmates as well as distinguished professors and other members of the alumni. I'm pleased to have the honor to introduce Amos Guiora, one of my classmates. We were speaking, Amos and my brother both graduated from Kenyon College, and Amos has had a distinguished career as a law professor, not only at Case, but also now at the University of Utah. I know that he has a lot to share with us, and without dragging on his introduction, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Guiora.
Good morning. So again, good morning.
Good morning.
Much better. All right. So we're going to talk about religious freedom, the freedom from religion, and national security. But by way of background, before I start talking about the larger subject, it's important to note how I got to it. So by way of personal background, those who don't know, I served for 20 years in the Israel Defense Forces in the Judge Advocate General Corps, where I've had the opportunity, for better or for worse, of spending thousands of hours with thousands of terrorists. And I found myself increasingly asking the following question to the terrorists, both Palestinian terrorists and Jewish terrorists. Why do you want to kill my children? And I'd been traditionally told, when you meet with terrorists, never ask the why question, the why do you want to kill? And I come from that school of thought that says if you're told not to ask something, to ask it. And the overwhelming response, not the only response, but the overwhelming response I got was because of religious extremism. And so that, for me, began to trigger some idea in terms of this confluence between religion/religious extremism and national security. And the more I thought about it, I decided that, perhaps because I don't have any hair, that it's important to address this issue head-on. And so I spent a year and a half researching religious extremism in 5 different countries. And I decided that the only way to do it was to go in-country, and the only way to do that was to interview literally hundreds of people worldwide. And so when I began the book project, I was stunned, I think would be the correct word, at how many people worldwide agreed to be interviewed by me via email, telephone, however, also in-person interviews. And here's the conclusion: that religious extremism presents the single greatest danger to civil society today. In saying that, however, I very clearly distinguish and delineate between religion and religious extremism. They are not one and the same. And so unlike others who engage in the religion bashing, I refuse to do that. I find that to be boring, and I think also intellectually dishonest and not particularly useful. So I am talking about religious extremism. I'm talking about religious extremism in the 3 monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So when you undertake this book addressing religion/religious extremism, one of the important questions to ask yourself is, what is religion? And I decided not to define religion, because you could write 5 volumes, thousands upon thousands of pages of what is religion. We all have different definitions of religion, and I put that aside. So I say with a smile, those of you who know me know what's coming. My religion, for instance, in addition to being, Jewish, is Michigan football. Wait, hang on. In the good old, I know we're in Ohio, but hang on. In the good old days, that used to be a sign of honor. I'm not sure about today. But religious extremism is the following. It is the articulation and the manifestation of a willingness to kill anybody in this room in order to bring honor onto the divine, however the person defines the divine. Again, religious extremism is a willingness to cause harm to innocent individuals in order to bring glory onto God. And a religious extremist actor clearly believes that in order to bring glory onto God, acting in the name of religious extremism, causing harm to innocents, is legitimate. That's what religious extremism is. By examples. I spent time in the Netherlands primarily because I had a Fulbright. And when you travel to go in-country to different countries, you obviously, in order to facilitate the discussion, you need somebody who's your handler. somebody who speaks the local language, local culture, and so on. So I'm on my way to dinner. How many of you have been to Amsterdam? Okay, good. So all of you know that, because you're all steeped in Dutch culture, you all know that Amsterdam is divided into 13 sub-districts, and that one of the sub-districts is largely predominantly an Islamic sub-district, which is about 99% population of Muslims, and the mayor of that sub-district is Islamic. So I'm on my way to dinner with this gentleman who's agreed to meet with me. Is one of the people I'm interviewing. We're to meet at 6 o'clock in the evening, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my handler receives a phone call that says the following, that a fatwa has just been issued against him. Everybody knows what a fatwa is? Say yes? Okay. Yeah. Now, the fatwa was not issued against him because he's having dinner with me, but the fatwa had been issued against him because the previous evening he had said on Dutch TV the following words: Islam must come to grips with homosexuality. And for that, the chief imam of Amsterdam, a guy named Darwish, issued a fatwa against my to-be dinner companion, Marcouch. So I was asked, do I still want to go have dinner with this guy, considering there's now a fatwa on his head? And I thought to myself, this is irony of ironies. It's too good to be true. The first person he's having dinner with is this Jewish guy from Israel who served for 20 years in the Israel Defense Forces. How perfect could that be? So I called my wife, who some of you know my wife, and I said to my wife, I said, should I go forward with dinner? Fatwa's issued, right? And in the hope that she would say no. And she said, no, go ahead. And so I get to dinner. We're having dinner in this very elaborate, beautiful Lebanese restaurant in Amsterdam. And there are guards outside, and there's police outside, the whole kit and caboodle. And I made the first fundamental mistake anybody who's been involved in counterterrorism makes, is we sat with my back to the window. And I asked him, so how are you doing? And because we're all adults, he said, shitty. And I said, why? And this is important. He said, because somebody who heard the fatwa will understand exactly what the imam said, which is to kill me. And so this person, from that moment on, lives a life under threat, having to sleep in a different bed every night. It is an absolute manifestation not only of extremism, but of the power of the word. The following day, there was a conference organized on my behalf at the University of Leiden, so I could present the book as a work in progress. And I don't read a word of Dutch. I know one word of Dutch, but I do know enough to be able to figure out the headline in the paper was Fatwa issued against Marcouch. And at this conference, there were 50 academics and Dutch national security types. The conference was all very pleasant, and finally I said to myself, this is odd. We're all dealing in national security issues and religious issues, and nobody's talking about the fatwa. So even though the party was on my behalf, I at some point decided to be a tad rude, and I said to my Dutch host, I said, well, what do you all think about the fatwa? And I got these totally blank looks. And I said, this doesn't make any sense. Let's do this again. How many of you have heard about the fatwa? And so, 2 hands go up. I said, this deeply troubles me because it means you are ignoring the reality. And that, of course, led to a pretty unpleasant conversation, which is okay, because if you're going to address a book like this, your expectation has to be that you're not going to make a lot of friends. But that's okay. And the following week, I met with the Dutch Justice Minister, who was extremely gracious with his time. And I said to him, Mr. Justice Minister, what are you going to do about limiting free speech if there is this fatwa out there, and future fatwas coming down the road? And his response was, well, we have to think about it. We're going to have to weigh various options. And I said to him, frankly, that is not the way to deal with religious extremism, because religious extremism kills. I said to him that the time has come to directly address it by, take a deep breath, thinking long and hard about limiting free speech in the context of religious extremism. Needless to say, the Justice Minister and I, agreed to respectfully disagree. But I'm going to circle back to that theme. From the Netherlands, I went to England. So obviously many of you have been to England, right? So there I had my handler there organize meetings for me with senior members of the British Home Office. So my very first meeting was with this very senior official in the British Home Office. He and his assistants, and we began with Professor Guiora, it's a pleasure and honor to have you here. Please have some kidney pie. I thought. So the first words out of his mouth were the following. Professor Guiora, you must know that there is no extremism in Islam. And I thought to myself, I got to spend 2 hours with this guy now. And he knows that I know that I know that he knows that's absolutely incorrect. And we finished the meeting, warmly shook hands. I went off to my next meeting with another security guy, and there too we began with the pleasantries and the kidney pie, and then he assures me, first sentence, there is no terrorism in Islam. So I thought to myself, what do I do with all this? When I started writing the book, the idea had been, if you've written with Oxford, they have 10 chapters, but thematic, not country by country. I said to myself, I have to change the book in its entirety, because the first thing I have to begin with is this week in London, in which I realized that there was an absolute refusal to, quote, look the tiger in the eye. And by failing to look the tiger in the eye, there is no way that society can truly address the issue of religious extremism. So I stand before you humbly and make the following argument, that society today, largely, for complicated reasons, grants religion, and particularly religious extremism, immunity. And precisely because we grant religious extremism immunity, we are incapable or incompetent or failing, pick your whichever adjective, to properly protect ourselves. After that disconcerting and troubling week in London and the time in the Netherlands, I went home to Israel. And because I live in Israel, I have a significant number of contacts, and I was able to meet with an innumerable number of people. And what interested me was the following. Retrospectively, how did those who were in positions of authority at the time of Rabin's assassination in November of 1995, how is it that they failed to understand and see the profound incitement on a daily basis that was happening in the streets in Israel daily, if not hourly? So I began with media. Media are important to this story. This is now criticism of the media, particularly in Israel. Most members of the Israeli media are what we in America would call liberal secularists. And precisely because they're liberal secularists, they don't really understand religion. And if you don't really understand religion, the easiest thing to do with religion is to be disdainful of religion and to be a tad cynical. So I met with one of Israel's most important journalists, somebody who's taken truly seriously in Israel, and I said, you and I were reading the same paper. I mean, I was reading your articles. How is it that you failed to clearly identify the issue of incitement, based and emanating solely from right-wing extremist rabbis? His response was the following. It never occurred to us that somebody would take them seriously. And I said, are you like kidding me? Do you go to synagogues? Do you see what's happening? Do you see the material that's being put out there? He said, if I have to take all of us as media, as a collective group, stereotyping, which is always dangerous, especially at a law school, they absolutely failed to see the threat that was coming down the road. So from there, I went to meetings with the Israeli Justice Ministry, and I said, on the assumption that if there's going to be a renewal of the peace process, and here we are with the peace process, perhaps once again already maybe derailed, but there's some kind of a peace process, it's only a matter of time before that same group, those extreme right-wing rabbis, will once again, yet again, engage in incitement. And so I asked the following question. Are you going to reconsider limiting the rights of free speech in the context of religious extremism? And the response that I got from somebody with whom I've worked for 20 years was very troubling, was, quote, you have to understand the context. What troubled me in that phrase, you have to understand the context, is precisely what I had been told 3 weeks before when I met with another Dutch national security guy. We're talking about incitement. There too, I was told you have to understand the context. And having to understand the context is a polite way of saying, no, we will allow free speech to go unabated because we value free speech more than any other value, more than any other guaranteed protection. So it's difficult for us, particularly all of us who are lawyers and steeped in the Constitution, to ask ourselves the following question. Should free speech, in the name of protecting society, be protected when the specific target is religious extremism? And so when I present this talk by now, both in Europe and in Israel and the United States, and in particular to constitutional law experts, most of them immediately break out in a cold sweat. But that's okay, because the only way to have this discussion is to have this discussion. So in Israel, I met, for instance, with senior members of our version of the FBI, the General Security Services, and I asked them the following question. Is it possible that with the renewal of the peace process, that once again an Israeli prime minister, right, left, center, will be the target, A, of incitement, and B, potentially a target of an assassination attempt? So a target of incitement, the answer is absolutely yes. Any of you who follow the Israeli media, you can read it in English on a daily basis. It's right around the corner. And in terms of a potential assassination attempt, one certainly hopes not. But is it out there? Of course it's out there. And does A, society, and B, law enforcement, do they adequately protect? The answer is no. Back to the Netherlands. The Netherlands has this extraordinary tradition of free speech, of enabling people to say whatever they want to say. That's the Dutch tradition, or has been the Dutch tradition until perhaps today. I don't know how many of you follow Dutch politics very carefully. There's going to be a new government, a new minority government will be supported from the outside by Wilders, he who has decided to directly take on Islamic immigration and the burqa and so on, which we'll also talk about. So there's this new discussion in the Netherlands about how to protect society. But what I came away from with the Netherlands, much like in Israel, was this absolute failure / refusal to directly engage in these problematic questions. Which brings me to the United States. So I think most of us would agree, never say everybody, I think most of us would agree that religious extremists do not endanger American society. But when I talk about religious extremism and the dangers it poses to society, I suggest breaking the affected community into two. There's what I call external community, and there's internal community. External community is the following. 9/11, the victims of 9/11 are external society. From bin Laden's perspective, it wasn't important who died. It's random, right? Terrorism is random. But in the context of internal communities, that is an inherent part of certain religious extremist groups. By example, the Mormon Church, which you all obviously are familiar with, has a branch, a spin-off called FLDS. It's the Church of Fundamental Latter-day Saints. They are the ones who view themselves as the true Mormons because they practice two things. One is polygamy, and the other is child brides. So with respect to polygamy, not to put it, to mock it in any way, but it just means having more than one mother-in-law, which is problematic in itself. But child brides is the following. It is ordained by the priest, by the minister, who I'll talk about in a second, forcing adult males to marry underage girls. And so adult males are marrying girls aged 12 to 14, and not only marrying them, but having full sexual relations with them. Those are child brides. Those child brides are my internal community, absolutely at risk because of priestly dictate. So the leader of the FLDS church, a gentleman named Warren Jeffs, was convicted a couple of years ago of the following crime: being an accomplice to a rape. He did not have sexual relations with the 14-year-old girl, but he dictated the marriage and the consummation of the relationship. So he was convicted 2 years ago of being an accomplice to a rape. The conviction was overturned in July, and there's a question now whether or not there'll be a retrial. But what's important here in the context of religious extremism is the following, here in the United States. One, that the priest, in terms of his interpretation of God's words, is forcing, no other word for it, for these girls to marry the men and to have sexual relations. The girls are absolutely unprotected. They are vulnerable because the internal community offers them no protection whatsoever. More than that, their parents turn them over to the husband in order to meet the obligations as dictated by the minister, by Warren Jeffs. So in writing the book, and because I live in Salt Lake City, I met with the Attorney General of the great state of Utah. And to his credit, he was incredibly candid and engaging with me in terms of researching the book. And I said to him the following. I said, Mr. Attorney General, where is the state of Utah? Where is local law enforcement to protect these girls? In parentheses, I need to add, not only are the girls endangered in the FLDS culture, but there's also something called abandoned boys in the FLDS culture. Abandoned boys are boys 14, 15, 16 who are thrown out of the community, left on their own largely in Salt Lake. They're brought to Salt Lake City, and the reason they're thrown out of the community is because they are viewed as a sexual threat to the adult males, as competition. So we have two communities at threat, the boys and the girls. This has been going on since well before I had hair. And I said to the Attorney General, where is the state? Where is law enforcement? And the answer I got, which is clearly articulated in the book, is the following: that it's extremely difficult to penetrate these communities from the perspective of intelligence information and having sources within. So I told him, I said, listen, I've been in this business of operational counterterrorism for 20 years. I get the bit that it's hard to penetrate communities. It's not impossible. The question is, how hard is the state willing to engage the extremist community in order to protect the vulnerable? And the answer is, it's an open question. But while we're having this discussion, as we're having it, girls are at risk. And so I try to meet with some of these girls. It was extremely difficult to arrange meetings with them because they truly are at risk, and I had a handler try to arrange that. And unfortunately, it did not work out. They did ask me, that said, even though I did not meet with them. They asked me in some way, and I say this with trepidation and true sense of humbleness, to literally be their spokesman, which I'm a tad uncomfortable with, and to let the world know that they are truly at risk. So the question then becomes, what do we do with all this? Do we say to ourselves, oh, woe is me? Or do we say we're going to proactively engage in a serious discussion about limiting free speech in the context of religious extremism? So here's how I suggest we go about doing it. I have identified that the fundamental actor in this entire discussion, the most important actor, is the faith leader. Having met, as I said earlier, with thousands of terrorists, here's what you need to know. The overwhelming majority of religious extremist terrorists don't wake up in the morning and say, I had a dream and God said for me to go blow up this side of the room. The overwhelming majority of religious extremist actors are acting solely on the basis of religious instruction guidance that they are receiving from a faith leader. There is this triangle, I guess using the word Trinity is not the right word, but triangle of God, faith leader, and religious extremist actor. There is not a direct link between God and the actor. Smack in the middle is the faith leader. So I suggest in the context of this thesis that the question is, what do we do with the faith leader? By example, here in the United States, a concrete example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Lost Boys in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Lost Boys in Minneapolis, Minnesota are what is called second generation Somalis. The first generation came from Somalia to the United States to live the American dream, just like my parents did when we came from Israel. The second generation are the ones who are radicalized. Not the first generation. The first generation are the dream, the second generation are the radicalized. By the way, in parentheses I add, it's the exact model used in England with respect to the Pakistani community. First generation were living the American dream in England. The second generation are the radicalized. So there is an imam in Minneapolis who radicalized the second generation. And radicalization is not only words, but radicalization is also action. So there are between 20 to 30 second-generation Somalis who went to Somalia. They didn't go back to Somalia because they weren't from Somalia. They went to Somalia to learn the tools of the trade. Tools of the trade, euphemism for learning how to become suicide bombers. Of the 20 to 30, either one or two of them has actually conducted a suicide bombing. One in Somalia, he died, which is good. He killed some innocent people, which is obviously tragic, and it's unclear if the second one actually went forward with it. But here's the troubling piece of information. The radicalization occurring in the mosque in Minneapolis, Minnesota was known to the FBI while the imam was radicalizing, or while he was inciting, or while he was preaching, whichever adjective you want to use. So when this was brought to my attention, I reached out to the FBI in Minneapolis, and here too, the special agent in charge in Minneapolis was extremely gracious with his time and totally on the record with me, to his credit. And I said to him, I said, if you knew, if the FBI, not you specifically, but if the FBI knew that this imam was inciting, radicalizing the second generation, how is it that you didn't do the following? Take a deep breath. How is it that you did not monitor or surveil the mosque? By way of quick background, I had given a talk 2 weeks before that in a major American city to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I said to them the following words. I said, the time has come for the FBI, law enforcement, to monitor houses of worship if it is known that there is incitement occurring inside that house of worship. So 50% of the audience was ready to throw tomatoes at me, and 50% of the audience thought I was exactly right. So if it balances itself out, much like a referee in football, if both sides disagree with you, you must be onto something, right? Like this. So I stand before you and I suggest and propose the following. That if we know that there's a house of worship, mosque, synagogue, church, where there is clear incitement occurring that has the potential to endanger either the internal or the external, then I suggest there is no alternative today but to proactively monitor and surveil that house of worship. Now, there's a long discussion as to what's the most appropriate mechanism for monitoring a house of worship. There are two schools of thought. One is to send the FBI in, white shirt, black tie with earpiece, and guy writing everything down. So it's clear to the audience, the participants, the congregation, that here is amongst us today, is Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. And option number two is to send the guy in dressed as if he's a member of the local community, as if he belongs to the congregation, which is obviously, there's an element of deception to it. So having asked this very specific, very narrow question of faith leaders of all three faiths here in the United States, I stand before you and say I've gotten different responses. Some say, send in the guy like this, earpiece, because then it's clear to one and all that exactly what is happening here. Some say that their congregants would feel very uncomfortable having, that little earpiece thing, and so they prefer, even though it's deception, to have the guy dressed as if he belongs. Clear to me that my proposal does the following. Best defense is a good offense. One, it absolutely has a potential chilling effect on people of faith. Two, it absolutely potentially limits freedom of speech. And three, it absolutely potentially imposes limits on freedom of religion. So that's what's bad with my proposal. What potentially makes it workable, however, is that my proposal would be applied in a very specific, narrow manner, predicated on having sufficient information in advance that justifies imposing on the chilling effect, and enough information to justify law enforcement's engaging with the faith leader. It's been suggested to me, and I think I'm going to accept this suggestion, that in order to minimize or mitigate the blow, it would make sense, it would be the right thing to do, whatever that means, for law enforcement to tell the faith leader before monitoring him, we're on to you. We're giving you due warning, fair warning, due process. Please know that if you do not stop, then we will begin monitoring you with the idea of potentially engaging you in criminal prosecution. Some have suggested that the practical result of my proposal is the following, that it will drive the extremist church or synagogue mosque underground. And if you drive them underground, then it'll be hard to track what's really happening. Then it becomes almost as if private religion. My response to that is probably not particularly convincing, but it's the only one I can come up with, and it says the following. Indeed, it may well drive them underground, and if they're driven underground, then it'll be hard to keep track of them, correct. But logistics are logistics. The more you drive people underground, only the true believer will stay. Because it'll be this, as if this war of attrition, war, problematic term, but call it war of attrition, that there'll be less and less people who will actually make the effort to come to the church, synagogue, mosque, because it'll be difficult to find, it'll be difficult to engage. So that does not mean that there will be no more religious extremist actors out there, but it means that I would be actively minimizing, or might not me, but the proposal would suggest actively minimizing the number of people who would be making their way to the congregation. There's another problem with this entire discussion, and that's called cyber terrorism or use of the computer. So, for instance, you think about the imam, the American citizen who is now in Yemen, who's been approved for targeting by the President of the United States because he's the one who incited Major Hassan to do Fort Hood and the guy, I think, in 42nd Street in New York. Use of the computer, potentially, down the road, will minimize the actual importance of the specific physical house of worship. So I've actually engaged, I don't know anything about computers, but I've engaged what I call like administrators and servers to ask them what would be their thoughts about limiting the use of their server in the context of minimizing free speech of a cleric 6,000 miles away. And the answers and responses I've gotten from the servers and the administrators has been, well, free speech, and free speech, and that if I got a reputation for limiting the use of my server, the person would go elsewhere. So that's I would say, a huge window of opportunity for the cleric who's thinking down the road, because at the moment his use of the internet is absolutely unlimited. So where does all that leave us? It means the following: that I, as uncomfortable as this makes people, and I will appreciate that, I read all the blogs about the book, I see no alternative today but to recommend that in a very specific manner that we limit free speech in houses of worship, provided, A, that there's information known that the cleric, the faith leader, is engaging in incitement. 2, that we know that there are people in that community who potentially will act on his words. And 3, that we can articulate a population that is at risk as a result of the words and of the ability of the community to act on those words. We have 2 options. We can say, this is a threat that will go away. Or we can say, the time has come to act. And so if I draw on my 20-year experience in operational counterterrorism, I stand before you and say, it is not going away. So we can be like the British, eat our kidney pie, which is, by the way, really distasteful, and say there is no terrorism, there is no extremism. We can be like my Dutch colleagues who prefer not to see it. We can be like my Israeli friends who are emphasizing free speech even though we have had a horribly traumatic event in Israel. Or we can be like the state of Utah has been until the past 5 to 10 years and ignore the threat. And I think to ignore the threat when it is palpable, when it is clear, visceral, and articulated, I think is to leave all of us unnecessarily exposed to a known risk. Having dealt with terrorists and with terrorism, there's something you need to know about them. They mean exactly what they say, and they say exactly what they mean. In my thousands of hours with them, I've yet to find a terrorist who exaggerated as to what he did or as to what he intended to do. And they are well aware, believe me, of the following. One is the power of their words in terms of the faith leaders. 2, they are well aware of the fact that the person of extremist faith wants to hear what to do. I can't emphasize that to you strongly enough. The extremist faith leader knows that his community is waiting for instruction. And 3, they well know how asleep at the wheel we are. You take those 3 together, and I lead with this, I finish because I won't have time for discussion. It absolutely means that we are unnecessarily vulnerable because of our refusal to look the tiger in the eye. One final word. There is no doubt that a talk like this, the book proposal, raises significant and profound constitutional questions. I am well aware of that. But I do believe that we as a society, as members of the society, social contract, Rousseau, have the absolute obligation to ask ourselves these difficult questions. On that note, thank you very much. Questions, anxieties, concerns on a Saturday morning? Yes, ma'am.
Based on what you said here, are you actually stating that what you would consider is to make speaking itself an actual crime?
No. What I am saying, it's a great question. What I am saying is that I would probably take Brandenburg and re-articulate it in the context of religious extremism as articulated in a house of worship. What's really important, that's why I said at the very beginning, I draw a very clear distinction between religion and religious extremism. I mean, there are obviously people here who, whether you go to a church, you go to a mosque, you go to a synagogue, wherever you go, I mean, faith is a great thing, and I'm deeply respectful of faith. It helps people in times of personal crisis. I think that's a wonderful thing. Religious extremism, which potentially endangers you, is not a wonderful thing. And so my proposal is narrowly limited to limiting the free speech, if, again, I have sufficient information to justify it, of the faith leader, but not limiting the speech in its entirety. David, I told you at the beginning you're not going to agree with me, right?
Well, actually, I don't think you go far enough.
Luke Katz just had a heart attack.
Have you had occasion to look at the Australian law in Victoria that makes it a crime to incite hate against religions and against race on a racial or religious basis? And does that apply at all in the context of what you're proposing?
Yeah, the Australian law is interesting. In parentheses, before I dive into the substance of it, when you write a book like this, you get the damnest outreach from people, world over who are supplying you with information all the time. So I actually taught a course in Utrecht, and there was a kid from Australia who was supplying me with information like this all the time. My concern about that law is I fear that it's not specific enough. If I take David's question and your question lead together, it strikes me as the problem is one needs to be very narrow and very specific as to how you articulate the law and then how you implement the law. The Australian legislation, having looked at it, strikes me as too broad, not sufficiently narrow, and I think maybe even in the context of the American Constitution, would probably void for vagueness and overbroad. Sir.
Wouldn't there be more comfort in some of these things if we were sure that at the top end, where decisions were being made, that there was strict control, strong punishment? My greatest disappointment in the Obama administration is we were promised, and I was an Obama supporter and still am, I suppose, but that we were promised some clarity on rendition not being proper, on what Karl Rove's misuse of the Justice Department how that might be different. There's all sorts of things that this administration I expected to disavow from the previous administration, and suggests to me that the rule of law applies not just in the synagogue or the mosque, but that it applies in the White House and the Justice Department. Wouldn't there be more confidence in doing this if I had more confidence about the top?
So a word about the top. Again, whichever administration. 2 years ago, I testified twice in Congress, once to the Senate Judiciary Committee and the other time House Homeland Security Committee. And because I believe in definitions, narrow definitions, specific definitions. So when I testified, I said, it's an honor to be here, blah, blah, blah. And I think we need to have this long discussion about definitions. And I am not a psychologist. I just happen to be the son of a psychologist. And I understand body language. And they all, went back in their chairs because the thought of defining terms and thereby limiting the executive is something that Congress is largely unwilling to do. Taking your question one step further then, with respect to the proposal, I've been asked, what do I think would happen if I reached out to members of Congress and I said, maybe we need to re-articulate free speech incitement and the limits thereof. And the response I generally get is a twofold response. One is, that's a really interesting idea, right? Two, given the current political realities in this great country where we have this extraordinarily unpleasant discourse. There's no discourse today, right? It's just each side is speaking like this. to advance the ball with respect to my proposal obviously is difficult because it is so contentious and so unpleasant at the moment. But I do agree with you that leadership here absolutely could and should play an absolute role in this. But there's an interesting sub-question to that. Just a second. If people understand that they are at risk, then maybe the impetus, rather than coming from here, needs to come from here. Food for thought. Sir.
If you can generalize, what motivates these faith leaders? Is it a sincere belief that killing other people is the right thing, or are there other extremist factors?
That's a great question. A number of things motivates faith. We're talking about the faith leaders now, right? One, this is a bad analogy, but I'm looking at the dean. So the dean also, this is a bad example, but the dean has different constituencies, right? You're supposed to say yes. You have different constituencies.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm happy you're playing along with me, Dean. That's why he's the dean. And the faith leader also has different constituencies. And here's what he has to show. He needs to show his community that he's delivering goods. He also is aware of the fact that there are competing voices out there. And so it's not enough to talk, it's critical to propel people to act. So his motivation, A, is, yes, faith, but faith leaders who I've met with, including some, let's call them extremist faith leaders who are, problematic. I'll give you an example in a second. They absolutely are driven to perform because they know that their community is watching them. And if they are unable to convince their people to act, the extremist community will lose faith in the faith leader. By example, I got the name of the rabbi who was long considered to have been in Israel, who was long considered to have been the one rabbi who most directly incited Yigal Amir to kill Rabin. So I called him. He was from Canada, moved to Israel, so we spoke English. And I cold called him, and he agreed to speak with me. And he starts the conversation off by saying, I assume that you've been told that I am the rabbi who most directly incited incited Amir to kill Rabin. And I said, it's indeed what I've been told about you. His response was, and I quote, if it were only true. I said to myself, dude, you need to be in jail. And we agreed that the next time I come home to Israel, we will meet. And I called him. And his wife, who manages his calendar, said that he won't meet with me. And I found that to be unfortunate, because I felt that would be a really important person to meet with. Somebody who's so committed, to inciting his community, and so convinced of the rightness of killing a prime minister. That's a person that, for my research purposes, is essential to meet with. I also said to the people I told you earlier that I met with the Israeli Justice Ministry and the law enforcement types, I said, have you detained him? Have you interrogated him? Have you questioned him? And I knew, because, don't ask a question unless you know the answer, right? That's what Katz taught me here 30 years ago. Here's the truth. In the aftermath of Rabin's assassination, November 1995, not one rabbi was brought in for questioning or interrogation by the Israeli FBI. Not one. From the perspective of the faith leaders, to your question, this is a terrible thing to say. Rabin's assassination, it's a terrible thing to say, could not have been better, because there was words, there were instructions to act, and I'll explain that in a second, and then the actual assassination. For those of you who are not steeped in extreme Judaism, you need to know there's something called Pulsa Denura, Pulsa Denura, translated into English means lashes of fire. And it is from the Kabbalistic, and it means the following. You put a Pulsa Denura on somebody, and it is a call to action against that person. And so as a run-up to the assassination, rabbis were standing outside Rabin's house in Tel Aviv on a nightly basis, and it's like casting a spell on somebody, I guess would be in best English. Casting a spell on him nightly. And their security guys were there. And the significance of a Pulsa Denura, or other word is Din Rodef, D-I-N Rodef, R-O-D-E-F, is that it's a call to action against the person deemed to be a traitor to the Jewish people. And Rabin was deemed by the rabbis to be a traitor to the Jewish people because he was engaging in a peace process with the Palestinians with the idea of giving, the West Bank back. From the perspective of the extreme faith leader, it's an absolute A to B to C. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was going to make a suggestion.
Yes, sir.
In your presentation, you use the word free speech.
Right.
And by the use of the word free, you almost set it up as being sacrosanct. I would recommend that we think back and remember the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, being the equivalent of saying the function of a civilized society is to first protect itself as a society. So if you remove the word free, it becomes a little bit easier to deal with the constitutional or the legal analysis of this thing from a, call it if you will, a philosophical basis. Then the only problem you have is the one that lady up there suggested. Are you really urging that we stop the speech before it takes place? In that context, we've got some basis here constitutionally to talk in terms of when national security deems it, and you get to Corbyn's word, who's going to make that decision? But I think if you remove the word free by saying, hey, all speech is too free.
It's really,
Like
right.
fire.
Right, it's really interesting. As I said earlier, I mean, I obviously, give this presentation a lot. And the idea, call it free speech, call it limiting speech, however you want to articulate it. The idea of limiting speech here in the United States is a concept, in spite of fire in the theater, right, according to Holmes, is a concept that makes people extremely uncomfortable. So what I've long struggled with, and I'm frankly open to suggestions on this one, is what's the best way to articulate it? So if it's called limiting speech in the context of protecting society, but that opens up a huge can of worms of who's society and how far do you go on protecting. But if I go back to the Minneapolis paradigm, or Minneapolis example, there I truly fault law enforcement. If it was known and it was known that the mom was engaging in this radicalization incitement, not to go monitor him or not to warn him or not to engage him, strikes me as fundamentally failing, both the local society and the larger society.
Obviously, to get to where you want this to be.
I'm sorry?
To get to where you're proposing will take new legislation. How do you propose addressing the disproportionate influence some religions have? In America, I'm sure we could get a pass for Islam real easily right now, but to do the same against extreme Christianity that's calling on abortion clinics to be bombed would be much harder.
So let me begin with a vignette, a story. In writing about religious extremism in the United States, I also met with various American officials. One of the individuals I met with, who unfortunately is one of the few people who was an anonymous, off-the-record source for the book, was involved in the trial of the right-wing Christian who killed the abortion-performing physician in Florida. Now, the guy who pulled the trigger is not interesting at all. I mean, he's just the actor. This person who was involved in the trial, to this day, does not understand why the pastor, who was directly inciting this guy, wasn't brought to trial. And there was clear evidence against him, overwhelming evidence, and the decision was made not to try him. So here in the American paradigm, the thought of limiting free speech, not only of maybe of today of Islam, maybe would be easier, but I wouldn't make it Islam only. I mean, there's no point in that. Specifically when we know there's also right-wing Christian extremists who are absolutely engaging in incitement. I mean, contemporary example, turn on the internet today and look at this Assistant Attorney General from the great state of Michigan. I mean, I don't know how many of you followed this guy. It's absolutely horrific what he's doing to the president of the University of Michigan student body is a homosexual. And this Assistant Attorney General in his private time has his own blog, took his picture and superimposed a swastika on him, calling him Satan's representative on earth because he's a homosexual. He was interviewed by Anderson Cooper, CNN, the other night, and he used a phrase that I'm not familiar with, and if somebody wants to help me out here, please help me out here. This is not some guy off the street. This is the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Michigan. He says, as a Christian citizen, and I thought we are American citizens. I'm unfamiliar with the term. I'm a Christian citizen. He says, by being a Christian citizen, I have the obligation and the right to identify him as Satan's representative on earth because he's a homosexual. I mean, I'm like, all right. That, in the context of free speech, he's stalking the guy. He's, outside his house with a camera. This guy goes to gay bars. He's following him at gay bars. That strikes me as something that absolutely must be limited. Uh-oh.
I'm not a First Amendment fetishist like some of my friends worship. But I think that vignette you just presented really identifies the problem with, number one, the notion of surveillance. I suspect, notwithstanding the Minneapolis situation, I imagine there's surveillance right now of mosques in this country, as there was over-surveillance of civil rights groups in this country. And I think that, people have the right to be a crackpot in this country. And somehow, and I don't think your definition does the trick, somehow you've got to distinguish between the crackpots and the person who is actually inciting to murder.
Okay. So for those who don't know, I have to work this in. I was asking myself how I'm going to work this in. When I was a student here, my absolute greatest mentor of all time is Luke Katz. So I had to put that in. And so is this like going back 30 years where Katz asks and I have to answer? So when I was a law student, the easy one was right, I passed. I didn't do the reading for today, but I can't do that one here. The test, Lou, I suggest is the following. If based on the past acts and the ability of the congregation to act, or if somebody to act, in the name of religious extremism, then I stand before you, as complicated and controversial and maybe provocative as it is, and say that person's right needs to be limited. So the attorney, the Assistant Attorney General from Michigan, I don't know who his audience is. I think he's been largely discredited. But a minister, rabbi, imam, standing in a house of worship and directly inciting a call to action, that's not a crackpot. That's somebody who, to your question, he knows exactly what he's doing. And I can't emphasize to you strongly enough that these guys are not crackpots. I'm often told, those terrorists are crazy. Absolutely incorrect. They have a clear mission, a far clearer mission than we do. And they are clearly aware, Lou, of the power of their words, and they have thought about their words long and hard. For example, I suggest all of you, if you have nothing better to do tomorrow morning, and I don't mean to offend anybody here, but turn on your TV tomorrow morning and watch any of these TV pastors or TV ministers. And televangelists. And here's what they do. It's fascinating to watch them. I've watched these guys a lot. They engage in what is called the snippet approach. They take X passages from the New Testament and repeat them over and over and over again. They just do, rerun. It's over and over again. And they have these 10, 15 basic snippets that they just repeat ad nauseum. And it's really extraordinary to watch the audience. The heads are bobbing up and down because the audience knows what's coming. It's a repetitive, and it repeats itself. It's like a chorus. And they're not engaging in broad discussion, nor are they really engaging in interpretation. What they're engaging is this narrow snippet-based approach that feeds right into what the audience wants to hear. And so in terms of the incitement, that is absolutely, and I don't know if it's English, an incitable audience. With respect to the Assistant Attorney General, I use him only as an example of raising important questions about the limits of it. But if he doesn't have an audience that he's going to impact, then we'd say maybe crackpot or problematic, but I don't think that he's the same as my minister, rabbi, imam.
Would your proposal have an impact on non-mainstream religions? For instance, there was a statistic recently about Buddhism in America, how it's perceived. Buddhism, as you know, preaches nonviolence, vegetarianism predominantly,
Yeah, right.
Well, Americans are already very, sort of prejudiced against anything that's not mainstream. So with with your proposal had a chilling effect on, say, a religion, that we're not, sort of, typified by maybe the last generation of Americans. For instance, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, Catholic, Protestant. For instance, a fusion religion, let's say a fusion religion. Something like that. Would this proposal have a chilling effect on someone who chose to practice that faith?
Interesting question. When I started writing the book, I was initially going to look at Christianity and Islam, because I read a lot about Judaism and Israel, and I decided I wanted to take a break from that. And probably the best piece of advice I got was from two professors, one at Georgetown and one at Harvard, who told me that if I don't write about Judaism, the book will be perceived as Islam bashing, because of who I am and where I come from. So with respect to your question, I don't know enough, to immediately think about Buddhism or any of these other religions, but if there are houses of worship broadly defined that are engaging and inciting, again, my external or internal, then I guess they would fall, subject to my proposal. And to give you just a twist on that, do all of you know what honor killings are? Everyone knows what an honor killing? Okay. So, in December of 2007, there was an absolutely horrific honor killing in Toronto. She comes home, she's 14, 15, comes home from a date late, and she's wearing tight blue jeans and all that, and the father had told her not to go on the date, and she went on the date. She comes home, she comes up to her bedroom upstairs, and her sister's in the bedroom next, and the mother's in the other bedroom, and he stabs her, 15 to 30 times and kills her. While she's screaming, the mother, of course, doesn't do anything, which is part of the parable. The following day, in the, what's the Toronto paper called? Globe and Star, Globe and Mail, whatever the hell it's called, whatever it is. On section E, page 55, like this, domestic violence comes to Toronto. So that's engaging, if I follow your question to its logical end. We need to absolutely identify the threats. And so if there are threats, I don't know enough, but if there are threats in these other churches, then right, no, then they're not. No, it's all thread-based. I get you. It's all thread. Right. Right, thread-based. Right, that's why it's thread-based. I need to add one more word about honor killings, just a second. When I served as a judge in the Gaza Strip in the mid-'90s, I sat in a case on an honor killing. For a series of complicated reasons that came before me, I will spare you the details because they are too horrific. What you need to know is the following. It took the two brothers 8 hours to kill the sister, because it's important in honor killings that she suffer, not fast death, slow death, 8 hours to kill her, at the step-by-step, minute-by-minute instructions of the mother who was there. So they're killing her over 8 hours. When the mother was in front of me, because I was the judge, right, what shocked me as a parent is the extraordinary lack of remorse and the absolute extraordinary sense of the conviction that this was the right thing to do in the name of religious extremism. It is more horrific than you can imagine. Professor Gabinet. The newly honored Professor Gabinet.
Amos, I'm wondering that if what you're suggesting is not, at least in this country, is using a cannon to swat a fly. I don't mean to minimize the threat of terrorism worldwide, but it seems to me that in this country, and anywhere, the real problem is not the homegrown terrorist. Like my colleague Lou Katz, I believe.
Wait, he's a homegrown terrorist?
Mosques.
Wait, did you say Katz is a homegrown terrorist? Did you say Katz is a homegrown terrorist?
No. What worries me are terrorists who are being trained with the blessing of the state in places like Iran, in places like Saudi Arabia. The real threat are from the mullahs in Iran and from the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. What you're proposing to limit free speech in the United States in order to avoid the possibility of some homegrown terrorist acting when we already are pretty much surveilling those people. Maybe not as much we should be, but I think we're surveilling them. I think we're on to them. The real problem is that we may be on a collision course with radical Islam in places like Iran and in places like Saudi Arabia. So what do you do about that?
So we're going to respectfully disagree. I think that if you track terrorism today in the United States, what you're increasingly seeing is pretty much the new European model, which is homegrown terrorism rather than external terrorism. If you track terrorism in the United States since post 9/11, you'll see that an increasing number of terrorist attacks here aren't coming from the outside. It's not, the 9/11 model no longer exists. The new model is domestic terrorists who are perhaps influenced by externals, but they're conducting internal. It's the exact model used by, in Madrid 2004, the London train bombings in 2007, the purported attacks to blow up the 13 British airliners, and the Glasgow attacks in 2008. External influence, internal actors. And so I think that precisely for that reason, what really is important is to look internally and to ask ourselves, where is the internal threat coming from? And the internal threat is indeed coming from the houses of worship. Hang on. If you look, for instance, at this seemingly foiled but still unclear attack that was supposed to occur in Europe this week, next week, the following week, the Mumbai type attack, of course, of 3 to 5 days, multiple sites, all actors are local. And so I really do believe that in the context of where we are looking at terrorism moving forward, the idea of this global jihadism, it's all external actors, I very much disagree with that. I view it as absolutely internal, externally influenced, meaning that we have to limit the power of the internals.
Okay. How do you define incitement? Because there were two people, I think, that got persecuted, put in jail, and thrown out of this country because in the past they have expressed anger without really inciting anybody, and that's Fawaz Damra and Sami al-Arian, and that this...
Right, got it. Interesting question in terms of how do we define incitement moving forward. I put a pretty narrow spin on it. The same things I recommended to the Israeli colleagues was that words that clearly have the power to influence an actor, bad English, actor to act, by causing, that would lead to violence. So in the context of free speech, I well understand free speech. I get it. But not if those words have the possibility, potential to cause harm to others. I'll give you an example. Just like, I was at a Michigan-Ohio State game a couple of years ago. Yes, Michigan lost. And
speaking of extremism.
And those of you who have ever been to Ann Arbor, campus, there's State Street and Southview, and the two converge. And there's a guy standing in the street corner, and I'm like depressed, Michigan lost. And this is too good to make up, because I'm actually writing the book while this is happening. And he's standing in the street corner yelling, what's yelling? Death to the Jews. In Ann Arbor. And I thought to myself, is that extremism, is that incitement, or is that crackpot? Crackpot. That's exactly right. But then I asked myself, what if there were 50 people standing with him all now yelling death to the Jews? So then the question becomes, what's his ability to impact a specific audience? So he was dismissible, and obviously everybody was dismissing him because he's crackpot. But the really important question, if I follow up with your question, sir, on this issue is, what's the speaker's ability to impact an audience? That's the question.
Is what you are proposing really a model for dealing with many forms of extremism, including political or racism in places like Germany? They dealt with certainly their Nazi, the history there by implementing certain laws, and I don't know if that is a model for how you want to go forward.
That's a great question. I mean, one of the criticisms of the book has been that my thesis would be better served if I were to not specifically point a finger at religious extremism, but to talk about extremism and have religious extremism coming under that. I've been told that would make it more palatable. So that's something speaking very frankly, I need to think about. But again, if it makes the proposal, like a better word, more palatable, then that's something that I would certainly be willing to consider in the context of moving the ball forward. Because then you're not pointing the finger at religion or religious actors, but you're pointing the finger at extremism with religion as a subset of that. So to your question, sir, I stand before you and say that's something that I'm frankly thinking about. It's been brought to my attention on a number of occasions. If that makes it an easier sell, then perhaps that would make sense. David?
Yeah, actually, sort of a couple of questions. Number one, do you limit your proposal to holy places? And for those purposes, do you include internet incitement? Do you include prisons where Wahhabi imams come into prisons and deal with prisoners for incitement purposes? I guess I'll just stop with those two.
I thought you were going to ask me if Michigan Stadium is a holy place.
Well, actually, something like the Minutemen, where you've got the McVeigh action. Does that fall within the definition of religion?
A word about religions, about prisons. Here's an uncomfortable statistic. This will make some of you very uncomfortable, but that's okay. In the California state prison system, as I stand before you, 50% of African American inmates are converting to radical Islam. So I reached out to the California state prison system, to the chief chaplain, because I wanted to go to the California state prison system to interview these guys. Because there's a real conflict today in jail, in California prison system, a real conflict between the gangs and radical Islam in terms of recruiting. There's a serious conflict. And it's unclear, for lack of better terms, who's going to win this. And so the question of incitement within prisons, using the California state system as an example of that, is a legitimate question. And just like the question from this gentleman here, it's something that I've been thinking about, don't have a compelling answer for you. But it's clearly as a place where there is something happening, something that one needs to think long and hard about. Absolutely. Sir, I like your hair.
So you interviewed all these terrorists, thousands of them, and
I didn't interview. I was meeting with them in various capacities when I was in the IDF.
So what's your understanding as to what prompts their actions? You say that the impetus comes from the religious leaders. Doesn't wouldn't the political actions of the states have something to do with it? What's bringing this? What causes it all?
It's a good question. I said at the beginning that I think that religion is a dominant influence, not the only influence. Some actors are clearly influenced by a variety of circumstances, be it economic conditions, response to various state actions. Those themes clearly run throughout, no doubt whatsoever. But the dominant influence, if you will, is the idea from the perspective of the religious extremist actor, what I said earlier, to bring glory onto God. And that just is a theme that runs throughout and all these and again, I emphasize with respect both to Palestinian terrorists and Jewish terrorists.
For considering the United States, not Israel. Considering the United States, does the United States government have anything to do with did the policies of the government cause a reprisal?
Right. Well, with respect to the FLDS, I don't think it has anything to do with the politics of the American government. It has to do with Warren Jeffs' interpretation of what's the appropriate thing to do in the name of religion with these little girls, devoid of government action.
Did the Attorney General back off from prosecuting because he was afraid of getting voted out?
No, as a matter of fact, the President Attorney General of Utah, Mark Chertoff, is the first Attorney General to have actively engaged them in terms of criminal prosecutions, to his credit. His predecessors did not. Did not. Did not. Did not.
Did not?
No.
Because they were afraid of the reprisals?
No, because perhaps they were well, I think what they were probably, the traditional argument is what Mark had made, that it's very difficult to penetrate these communities. But as I said earlier, having been involved in the counterterrorism intelligence gathering industry for 20 years, that's not an argument that holds particular sway with me. Does not hold particular sway with me. Many communities are indeed penetrable. Depends on how you go about doing it. Depends on will. Sir.
Yes, sir. Accepting your definition of incitement, to what extent, if any, does that is that not encompassed by existing conspiracy statutes here in the United States?
So I'll turn to Katz. I think that if it's the individual faith leader.
I think you'd have a hard time finding an agreement
right.
to prosecute under
Exactly as Kat said. Yeah, hard time finding the conspiracy there in terms of agreement. Yes, ma'am.
I have a little bit of like deciding whether this is really the chicken or the egg, which came first. And I'm wondering if these people that are involved in terrorism haven't chosen to go the religious route because that vehicle is already there for them to power. Whether it was Hitler or whether it's the imams, they've got a vehicle there that they can claim that they're getting an edict from higher powers. And all of the people who really want and feel that there's something there will go to this person because of that. And if that's the situation, then by limiting freedom of speech, or limiting speech as we're talking about, what are we really accomplishing?
Right. So first of all, if we would have had this talk 30 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about religious extremism, we'd be talking about secular terrorism. If you look at Germany, right, Baader-Meinhof and Red Brigade and so on. But today, here we are, 2010, what we really are talking about, like it or dislike it, is religious extremism. That's the motivation.
You feel from having worked with these people that they haven't used the religion, that they really, truly, sincerely believe
I do.
that that's it.
Yes, ma'am.
So you're defining fundamentalism then? You're saying
Extremism.
You're saying religious extremism is the equivalent of fundamentalists.
I don't know, I'm saying that religious extremism is an extremist interpretation of religion whereby killing you is justified in the name of religion. Not you specifically.
But you're calling that, we could call that loosely fundamentalist.
I don't know, I'd call it extremism. No,
Okay,
extremism,
just
no.
extreme, okay.
Sean.
Please wait for the mic, 'cause I'm a very loud speaker.
But he has to Sean, he has to capture your word.
Professor Cass called on me very early on in my law school career. I've known you a long time, and you're not in favor of prohibitions on free speech, is he, Alan? He's not like that. But you obviously think your proposal does not take us down the slippery slope, right? I think
It does or does not?
You believe it does not, because you wouldn't have proposed it. Why do you think this is not the first step down the slippery slope, and at what point do we reach it?
Great question. So I don't think that it leads us down the slippery slope because I would apply it in a very narrow, specific manner. And if you look, for instance, at the policies, somebody previously asked about, post 9/11 and the Obama administration. If you look at the Obama administration's and Bush administration's policies post 9/11, I would say that because we're in the business of grading, I give both administrations somewhere between a D and an F in terms of their counterterrorism policies, because they absolutely have failed to engage in narrow, specific counterterrorism. They've done void for vagueness and overbroad and so on. My proposal is very much tailored to a very specific audience, to faith leaders, narrowly applied and very specifically applied. And that, because I'm extremely sensitive to the slippery slope, having been involved, obviously, in counterterrorism decisions for 20 years, I will understand how easy it is to go down that slope. Here, I really do believe there's an articulated threat, and the proposal very specifically tailors a very narrow audience. Yes, ma'am. How are we doing time-wise? Doing fine.
I just want to make a comment very quickly. In terms of your statement that you don't think it would lead down a slippery slope, I don't want to continue to bang on this, but if something were actually passed, the general public does have a tendency at times to invent things in a piece of legislation that aren't actually there. And I guess I could just kind of see this really sort of polarizing a lot of members of society, having them take sides against Islam or for Christianity or against Christianity in that.
Right, so that's why I'm very specific in not talking about Islam, Judaism, or Christianity. I talk about houses of worship where there's incitement occurring. And obviously, you're right, there's an important balancing discussion here in terms of how does society, A, protect itself, how does society protect itself, and B, how does society protect the rights of individuals who are engaging in faith. Balancing here is critical, and if I take Sean's question and your question together, what's essential here is to narrowly articulate the legislation and to narrowly and specifically apply it, absolutely. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think in your proposal earlier when you were talking about monitoring houses of worship and when you have to go in, I think obviously you've got the insightful language by the religious leader or whatnot, and then I think the third one was the creation or presence of a risk or harm.
Presenting creating a
Right.
risk, right.
How would you go about analyzing or evaluating that risk? How specific does it have to be? And wouldn't the insightful language itself, does it need to be, kill this abortion doctor, or, we're targeting this specific building in Manhattan? Because it seems like you've got the direct threat, and then you've got other language that could be insightful, but also very general. And I was wondering just, how you sort of walk that line, and especially if you're talking about proposing specific legislation, how would you craft something like that?
That's a great question. So I've found over the course of, working a lot with law enforcement communities broadly defined, that there's probably a need for a greater understanding on their part as to the meaning of particular words in the religious context. If you follow religious speakers of different faiths, you'll see what they do is they engage in what's called coded speech, or what somebody referred to as metaphorical speech. In order to really understand what the faith leader is really saying, law enforcement literally has to translate that from what he's saying to something that they can better understand. It's a long process. It's very difficult. So now I meet with the FBI, for instance, and we have long talks about this, the translation of coded religious speech into how do you really then articulate incitement, earlier question about how to define incitement. It's not an easy process. And going back to Sean's question about the slippery slope, if you don't narrowly define what's really being said, then indeed you can go down that slippery slope. And that's why I'm very specific here, linking these three pieces together in order not to engage in overbroad. Absolutely.
Did you entitle the talk freedom? Did you entitle the talk freedom from religion, or was that?
No. Anybody who's written a book, no. Anybody who's written a book knows that you spend hours with your editor thinking what title will be like catchy, and so the original title. This was not the original title, but it's the title that we all chose, and so that's the title that's being used for the talks.
Well, it seems like you have a real problem, because if you're for freedom from religion and what you're talking about is just directed towards religion, you're discriminating against religion, which at least in this country would never fly. On the other hand, if you're saying this should apply to any organization where there's incitement to violence, then you're talking about including Greenpeace, any kind of like the anti-fur movement, because there's some people who believe in violence who are part of every movement. So then you're really in a slippery slope. And in the 60s and 70s, there was something called COINTELPRO. It was a huge program where they were infiltrating all kinds of organizations. Here in Cleveland, there was a Red Squad, at least throughout the 60s, where they would even take pictures of people at anti-war demonstrations. You're talking about a really slippery slope.
No, we're going to respectfully disagree. I mean, when I use the title "Freedom from Religion," the idea really is to ask ourselves, how do we protect ourselves from religious extremism? And in the book, the subtext of the book is rights and national security, and that really is, I would suggest, the proposal reflects a confluence of the two. And I think the proposal is sufficiently specific, narrow, that it enables avoiding the slippery slope which has been referred to.
What I'd like to know is, everything is wonderful that you've taught us about and told us, but what can we do? We've talked about everything, but what can we do? And if we don't do something, we could go to meetings and lectures, read a book. We're still back where we started. So if you could help us as individual citizens, groups, because Congress, in a sense, could do nothing unless the people as a whole speak out and let the world, at least the United States, know. And if we know, and it's going to be broadcast, it's going to go around the world. And that you have to start someplace, and we have to do it with the people who are here. What is your thought?
No, I think you're absolutely right, ma'am. I mean, I'm a big believer in, I don't know if it's an appropriate term, I've called it, citizen activism, if that's the right term. I'm told that in November there's something called congressional elections. I'm told this happens every 2 years. I really do believe that the public polity has an absolute responsibility to engage members of Congress on issues that are important to them. That's why they run for office every 2 years. I get an innumerable number of emails from people all over who I've never met, obviously, after they've heard the talk, read the book, seen it, whatever, asking me this exact question. And I really do believe on this issue that, because it's not going to come top down, in fact, I think, Tom, you asked that earlier, it's not going to come top down. I really do believe that an issue like this requires, justifies citizen involvement bottom up. Difficult, not easy. I mean, there are innumerable number of issues out there, and people's attention span is short, and members of Congress have all kinds of issues. I understand there's an economic crisis, but this has significant impact on all of us. So to your question, ma'am, I really do believe in citizen activism bottom up. I think it has, in that sense, as complicated as it is, as fraught with danger as it potentially is, I don't really see much of a choice.
I'm sitting here listening, and I'm thinking, gee, the KKK was a terrorist organization. We didn't put the label on it. Civil rights movement sort of defanged the worst of the KKK. What kind of thing can happen today that will have the impact that you're seeking on things like the KKK? Because it's the same issue.
Impact in what sense, sir?
The KKK, nobody could defang it, nobody tried. We didn't even realize how bad it was.
Right.
We got the civil rights movement, we got political activism. I think the power of the KKK has been diluted greatly, if not quite totally. It's still out there. I'm sitting here and saying, all right, 9/11 didn't do it. Is it
In
gonna
terms
have
of forcing us to act, is that what you mean, sir?
Yeah, we need
Right.
something to trigger it. It's the only way it's going to happen in this world, I think. And what can happen that will trigger it?
It's a great question. I was not in the States at the time of 9/11. I was living in Israel. So I only have secondhand information as to its immediate impact. I was sent by the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, half a year after 9/11 for a variety of reasons, but I wasn't here in the immediate aftermath. Probably 9 years afterwards, 9/11 is, I don't want to say forgotten, because that would be incorrect, but people's attention span is extremely short. Where, if I take your question, sir, and Professor Gabinet's question, where we're going to disagree, is I really do believe.
That got your attention. I think you're out of time.
Well, that is a hint from the above. If I take Professor Gabinet's question and your question, where I disagree with Professor Gabinet, is I'm extremely disconcerted by the phrase I'm going to use, because I understand American history. There is a clear and present danger. Now I know hang on, for those of us who are steeped in American history, that immediately sounds like McCarthyism all over again, and there's a danger here. Believe me, I'm well aware of the danger. But I do believe that there's this clear and present danger that, if I take the question from over here, to ignore it is just a risk we can no longer take. And that ties in, hang on, and that ties into the fact of this issue of citizen activism, if we can call it that. I think take these two together, and I really do see it as almost as a call to action. Ed?
One of the problems that I have with your concept here has to do with the internet. You touched on it briefly, but if you follow your suggestion through to its logical conclusion, doesn't that mean that the government would be forcing servers in the U.S. to refuse to take in an imam from Saudi Arabia to allow him to broadcast? I mean, there's the First Amendment problem with the freedom of speech, I think.
In terms of free speech on the internet, it's obviously a developing issue. I mean, it's something that a number of scholars are writing on, addressing, trying to find some kind of a solution. I assume by now, you've heard me for an hour and a half. I come from the school of thought that says you constantly have to ask yourself, how do we protect ourselves? And to say that something is difficult is something that I've never found to pose a particular challenge. I mean, it's hard. Of course it's hard. But that doesn't mean we can't engage in the question. And so perhaps if we can, as almost like a final question, do we have time? Or 2 minutes? Hang on. Is I really do believe that if there is this clearer threat out there, and I propose that there is this clearer threat out there, that the only way to address it is to ask ourselves, how do we go about protecting ourselves? And it's easy to say, well, it's hard. Well, there are a lot of things that are hard. And I just don't see any alternative other than to engage in citizen activism and to begin asking ourselves, how do we more effectively protect ourselves while protecting the rights of others? I mean, there's this balance. And if the cyber or the internet poses this new challenge, then, then the best minds at play have to be put to it and to try to come up with some kind of a workable solution.
I'd just like to follow up on what can citizens do and how did we defang the Ku Klux Klan? If you're correct, and I don't doubt that we have to be worried about radical Americans or radical American-born citizens becoming terrorists, I think we also have to be concerned about the issue of what we are doing as a society to present that. You're always going to have these horrible religious leaders. But we kind of differentiated ourselves from the Europeans for a long time because second-generation Muslims were integrated into our economy, educational system, and the like. But we're also giving these imams, incentives by the hatred that's come out about building mosques in New York City, but not only New York City, all over the country.
The guy who wanted to burn the Quran.
And burning the Quran, of course. And as Americans, we can have an effect upon that type of behavior. We can't stop the lone renegade who's going to go
Right.
off. But we're not doing that job. We're not mainstreaming tolerance and acceptance and integration in our society enough today. Sorry.
That's fine. So perhaps as a final word, because I see that Dan stood up, which means I have to sit down. How to balance these extraordinarily complicated, complex issues is perhaps the most burning question of the day today. As a final word, I say we have no choice but to engage in this discussion, not tomorrow, but today. And for that, I want to thank the Dean and for others for making this opportunity possible. Thank you very much.